Now, the talk that I'm giving tonight, which is on making lives invisible, managing refugees outside of the West, is sort of based on work that I am currently in the process of developing around questions of urban refugees, on local governance, on humanitarian protection, and also, on the other hand, on the practices of hospitality, security, and policing on the other. So looking at the ways in which these different issues sort of intersect with each other. So I think in doing so, what I do is mirror the work of many other scholars who have been working on forced migration for a long time. But what I attempt to do is use their work to consider fundamentally urban questions. So I should say this from the outset. I'm a geographer. I'm an urban geographer. I see myself very much as an urbanist. And I approach the question of refugees and forced migration from that particular lens as someone who's interested in understanding the processes and the politics of urbanization, particularly in the Global South. So when I look at the ways in which I sort of echo some of the things that have been talked about by other scholars who've been working on forced migration, like them, I'm also interested in understanding how the refugee body and its management informs us of the politics of policing, of immobility, of citizenship, racism, and xenophobia, but in non-Western contexts, and how these kinds of analyses may open up avenues into understanding how nation states, citizenship, and community are constructed, and how protection is understood and debated. But I want to take this further and think about how local governance and non-camp or urban contexts have become crucial new means and sites of refugee protection, and what that means in turn for not just the futures of refuge, and in this case urban refuge, but also urban futures, as we like to talk about it. So while I'm unable to touch on all the different things that I've kind of mentioned in the start of this talk, I think that these are important avenues of research as we attempt to sort of grapple with different kinds of crises and often overlapping crises in different parts of the world, as academics, as practitioners, and as activists. And I believe that without a nuanced understanding of social relations and governance at different scales, it becomes problematic to develop compelling insights or actions for refugee protections in different contexts. So with this in mind, I'd like to embark on a discussion of the management of refugees coming out of the Syrian conflict. Now, as we know and has been talked about quite a bit in the course of this conference, that there has been a fair bit of media coverage on this, largely because of the sheer number of people who have begun to leave the region and make their way through new routes in Europe. And as has been talked about by different scholars in different disciplines, the desperate passage of refugees and migrants into Europe using precarious routes through the Mediterranean is not new. And as many anthropologists and political geographers, amongst others, have noted, people have been attempting to cross the Mediterranean into Europe for a long time, and we've seen sort of more sophisticated and draconian models being used to stop them, turn them back, or simply detain them for very long periods of time. And we've also seen this, obviously, in other contexts in the United States, as some of the papers from yesterday talked about, but also, as we've seen from the film, which was, for me, very depressing, in the Australian context as well. And what scholars have talked about is that that these kinds of the routes are being used by different people, and the kinds of processes that are being used to stop them, as we've seen even in the film, effectively these, as we see more and more, are attempts to immobilize people for long periods of time. And as some scholars have talked about, as ways of colonizing their time, colonizing their futures. And we see what effects that colonization then has on the mental and other and physical well-being of refugees and migrants themselves. But I want to sort of shift away from the narratives of refugee management in the context, in Western context, to sort of considering them in non-Western contexts. And I understand that these labels of Western, non-Western can be quite problematic, but please indulge me here. I find all categories of categorizing different parts of the world problematic, but I will use this particular categorization in this instance. And I'm moving to a non-Western context partly because this is where the bulk of my work lies, but also because in this particular instance, certainly, the Syrian conflict and the way it's been contained and managed has largely taken place within the Middle East itself. And yet, like many other conflicts and displacements before it, very little attention has been given over to thinking about the intricacies of this refugee movement and management within the regional context itself, as people like Don Chabi, for example, has noted. So my question is, what can we learn from this context, and how would that help us gain a more global understanding of managing refugees? And here, I'm sort of more interested in thinking about how the critical work that has been developed in relation to detention and the management of refugees in Western contexts could perhaps be useful in thinking about non-camp contexts in non-Western settings. In other words, how does the enclosure and the marginalization and the othering of refugees occurring in refugee camps or in detention centers map onto other geographies, including those of cities? So importantly, I wish to understand how enclosure and marginalization, in this case, emerges as a result of informality and also as a result of ad hoc enforcement of policies by different stakeholders at different scales. So in order to illustrate some of what I'm talking about, I'm going to turn my attention to the context of Lebanon, where I have worked for a long period of time. Now in Lebanon, over 1 million Syrians have been displaced, and the country itself has a population of about 4 million people. So what we're looking at effectively is that a quarter of the population in the country is now Syrian. Now, the numbers, 1 million or a little over 1 million, are the formal sort of numbers. Informally, the numbers of Syrians in the country are much higher. And I think some of the presentations yesterday, for example, pegged the numbers at 1.8. And one of the things perhaps to note also is that UNHCR very clearly notes that the government of Lebanon asked them to stop registering refugees after June 2015. So that plays a major role in thinking about the numbers of Syrians who we see when we look at these at the data. But if we look at the sort of intricacies of the Syrian conflict and displacement into Lebanon, we also have to take into account the sort of longer and complex history between the two countries. This is a history that sees sort of intertwined kinship relations. It's also a history of conflict and occupation. Lebanon itself also has a complicated relationship to the question of refugees. As a non-signatory to the Refugee Convention, it does not recognize refugees. It does not see itself as a country of asylum, but rather as a country of transit. However, it is bound by the principle of non-refoulement and by the obligations of human rights treaties which it has signed and incorporated into its constitution. The country does not really refoul people. And I say that with that caveat because there have been reports that have been published previously talking about how in prior instances, Iraqi refugees, for example, have been refouled from Lebanon. So it's something to keep in mind. The country has also grudgingly hosted refugees from various countries for a long period of time. So even though it doesn't talk about itself as sort of a country of asylum, in fact, as some people have been talking about, many countries which are not signatories to the Refugee Convention end up actually hosting refugees for very long periods of time, and very large flows of refugees as well, and Lebanon is an example of that. Now, the refugee history of Lebanon is also not complete without an acknowledgement of one of its largest and longest standing refugee populations, the Palestinians. This long history of hosting Palestinians has been fraught, especially as many Lebanese tend to blame Palestinians for the political instability and the earlier civil war in the country. And the anxiety with Palestinians has spilled over into policies that affect Syrians today. So for example, in Lebanon, there is a policy of not having formal refugee camps. And this policy is very much informed by the history that it has of Palestinian refugees and Palestinian refugee camps. So there is a ban on sort of formal camps, and Syrians also are not referred to as refugees. They are referred to as displaced persons or as de facto refugees, categories which in the country have little or no protection. Now the policies towards Syrians have also changed a fair bit over the last few years. Before 2014 or 2015, there was a reasonably open border between Syria and Lebanon. Before this was shut in 2015, or much more policed. Syrians seeking refuge in the country had one of two options after that point. Either they would have to register with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or find a Lebanese sponsor to remain legally in the country. And both groups of people were required to pay a $200 annual fee for the renewal of their papers, present a valid ID, an entry slip that would have been obtained upon the entry at the border, submit a housing pledge, confirming place of residence and lease agreement, provide 2 passports stamped by a Lebanese official. So there's a fair bit of paperwork that is expected out of Syrians who are trying to live legally in Lebanon past a certain point. Those Syrians who are opting for the sponsorship route, instead of choosing to register with UNHCR, have to provide a pledge of responsibility signed by a Lebanese national or a registered entity for a work permit or sponsorship of an individual or a family. So with these kinds of policies in place, effectively what we see with the Syrians is that they are being treated much more as migrants than they are being treated as refugees, or they're being classified as such, especially with those who go down the sponsorship route. And without these papers, they're seen as being illegally present in the country and can be arrested and detained for weeks on end in prison. Now, for those who are choosing to register as refugees, this registration does not provide legal status, but does enable them, in some instances, to receive assistance. It does, however, come with numerous restrictions in exchange for refuge, including a pledge not to work. Earlier this year, the annual $200 residency fee was waived for Syrians, provided that they were registered with the UNHCR before the 1st of January 2015, or obtained residency through the UNHCR certificate at least once in 2015 or 16. But this policy continues to exclude nearly 500,000 Syrians who are not registered with UNHCR. And I'm not going to sort of get into the discussion of how difficult, in fact, it is to register with UNHCR. I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer session. There are obstacles that come in the way of people who are actually trying to register with UNHCR as well. The thing to note here is also that while we talk about these policies that the Lebanese government has put in place for Syrians, that they are not enforced sort of in a uniform manner. They're enforced in a very ad hoc fashion. And what we could argue from looking at that ad hoc enforcement of policies is that effectively what we are seeing is an informal means of controlling refugees. And I would argue here also that what we're seeing to these policies in a place like Lebanon is a privatized response to the crisis. That has in effect rendered thousands of Syrians invisible in the country, even though they are present in large numbers. Invisibility is a key feature of this privatized response. The problematic classification and the invisibilization of Syrians is done with specific political calculations in mind. To counter a supposed existential threat, and some would argue also to deflect the blame of governance and development, or the lack thereof in different parts of the country, from the government to the Syrians. So there has been a sort of a ratcheting up of the rhetoric around blaming Syrians for all kinds things, including the failure of infrastructure in different parts of the country, and so forth. And this sort of ad hoc, privatized response to the crisis has considerable effects on the everyday lives of refugees themselves, and these are manifold. So, but particularly the policies that include these sort of costly renewals of permits have had a considerable impact on the social welfare of Syrians, and this is probably the most important impact that we've seen coming out of a lot of reports by different NGOs. In poorer families, and this is the majority of the Syrians in the country, very often it's only one person who's able to renew their paperwork in a family. And it will privilege whoever is able, who would be the primary breadwinner. And the result of that is that the rest of the family then becomes illegal because only one person can afford to have their papers renewed. And the flip side to this is also that there are some very interesting gender implications for this kind of impoverishment. So, for example, if people are unable to afford to renew their papers, it's usually men who are stopped at different checkpoints, or in their raids into informal settlements or other places, it's men who are picked up. So who do you send out to work? Who do you send out to pick up food or money or whatever it is? It's women and children. So there's sort of, we start to see sort of very interesting gender dimensions to the policies that are being put in place in Lebanon as well. Now, the insecurity that is created as a result of these kinds of policies also impacts children in very particular ways. Because, especially children who are born in Lebanon, it's very difficult for parents to register their births because they would have to go to the Syrian embassy in order to do so, and many of them are reluctant to do that. And so what ends up happening is that we're seeing a lot of children who are also becoming stateless in the country, which has quite serious repercussions for them for the future as well. But let me turn this aside. Let me sort of turn to looking at the sort of urban questions, which I find quite interesting in all of this, and think about the sort of subnational scales of governance, of social relations, and practices of informality that have become embroiled in the policing and the erasure of bodies. And here what I'm trying to do is not create a sort of straightforward narrative of oppression, but rather draw attention to the different ways and contradictory ways in which non-camp spaces provide complex understandings of policing and silencing of refugees. So my aim here is to argue that informal practices control and can control people, but can simultaneously be imprisoning and flexible, mirroring many of the features that we would see perhaps in places like detention centers or in camps. And as has been noted by many scholars, the discussion of refugees and refugee management tends to fixate on the scale of the nation state, because this is ultimately where we see the sort of policies and the legal sort of work being done around migration and migration management. Nevertheless, as Jennifer Hinman so eloquently reminded us yesterday, that there are perhaps other scales at which we can and should imagine the management of refugees. And I tend to agree with this because while migration matters are certainly determined at the scale of the nation state, the everyday management of it is done at the subnational scale, with regional governments, with local governments, and even down to neighborhood levels of policing and surveillance that often play important roles. And in non-Western contexts, and again, I'm speaking only in certain instances, the issues of hosting and managing refugees at urban and regional scales can be somewhat complex. Firstly, because of the sheer numbers of people that arrive as forced migrants, and we've seen this, and we've heard about this in a lot of the papers, that when we look at sort of refugee influxes, another problematic term, we look at we don't simply see like a few hundred people coming, or even a family coming, but we see tens of thousands of people coming. And very often, there will be particular regions in a country that will receive larger numbers of refugees than others. And that kind of region, and that effect at a regional scale is something that scholars such as Lauren Landau, amongst others, have talked about, that there's sort of, you can almost see the different kinds of attitudes that people will have towards refugees in different regions, depending on how many refugees they're hosting in these places. And this pressure that is exerted by large numbers of refugees coming on infrastructure and services in many developing countries is quite immense, particularly where these things can be quite limited even for the local residents. And intervening in these spaces by humanitarian organizations can also be quite problematic, because very often, and again, as practitioners and others have pointed out, the standards for humanitarian interventions and of shelter and so forth is higher very often than what is enjoyed by local communities in many of these host states. So that creates some very interesting tensions between host communities and forced migrants, particularly as we see the interventions of these humanitarian groups. And finally, informality is often seen as a prominent feature of urbanization in the Global South. And while this can be debated at length, what is important to note is that many refugees who come into urban areas move into informal settlements. And they do this because this is where they can access cheaper accommodation, they can access work, and if necessary, vanish into the local population in the country. So the two images that you see behind me, one of them is of an informal settlement in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and the other is of an informal neighborhood in the city of Tripoli in northern Lebanon. And these are the kinds of spaces, these are the kinds of spaces in which Syrians are living today. The lack of sort of legal recognition and protection and the scattered nature of residence leaves many Syrians at the mercy of different actors, from the Lebanese army, municipal authorities, landlords, and local communities. A closer look at the practices of some of these actors reveals an ad hoc and contradictory nature of their relationship to Syrians. So for example, some municipalities have responded, different municipalities in Lebanon have responded to the crisis in different ways. So some municipalities are not keen on hosting refugees. So they don't allow refugees in the municipality, and they don't allow humanitarian organizations to operate in them. In other places, municipalities have imposed curfews. And it's interesting that they have tried to do that because they are not actually allowed to impose curfews. The municipal authorities are not allowed to impose curfews. The army can do that and so forth. And still other municipalities have allowed refugees in, and some of the places that we visited, including the municipality where this informal settlement is located, have more refugees than they have local residents. And the population has almost doubled or tripled in some instances. And what many municipalities try to do is keep a closer eye on Syrians who are residing in their jurisdiction. So, I'll tell you a story. So one day, when we were doing a field visit to all these informal settlements in the Bekaa Valley, my research assistant and I were having sort of a long conversation with one of the municipal police officers who were accompanying us on this long ride. We visited like 4 or 5 different informal settlements that day. And at length, like everybody else in the municipal office, starting with the mayor down, there was a lot of complaints about the Syrians and how they had created problems with regards to garbage and law and order and so on and so forth. And that they were a burden to the municipality. But there was also sort of this sense of resignation by the police officer and also by others, because their question to us was, where are these people supposed to go? Right? I mean, the war wasn't their fault, and it's our duty as Lebanese people to host them and to support them in the, until they can return. And these kinds of conflicting sentiments of hostility and support are not simply discursive, but also play out in practice. So on one hand, municipalities will police Syrians, but on the other hand, they will also intervene to release many Syrians from the custody of the Lebanese army. So the army very often goes into these informal settlements and have done, particularly in the settlement that I have an image of here. And they will arrest people. They will arrest people either because they are suspected of committing a crime or because they are suspected of not having their papers. And so what we see is that municipalities will, very often also intervene to get Syrians released from the custody of the Lebanese army as well. And although having the support of municipal authorities signals a flexible approach to managing non-camp refugees, this flexibility is also quite precarious. Because Syrians ultimately are at the whim of municipal authorities, including the police, as well as the Lebanese army and local power holders. And these different stakeholders can and do exercise arbitrary use of power that can range from being oppressive to lenient. And here I'm kind of reminded of some of the work by Didier Fassin, amongst others, his most recent book being on prison worlds, looking at how the well-being of prisoners is contingent on the exercise of power by guards themselves. And such a scenario, for me, is not any more liberating than a camp, and in fact could perhaps even be worse in some ways. We can explore this issue not just through the arbitrary practices of policing by authorities, but also through informal social relations between refugees and hosts. And again, the classification and the illegalization of Syrians in Lebanon plays an important role in how they are treated within this context. So devoid of any legal protection, many Syrians are compelled to engage in informal work and live in informal shelter that is privately rented, and these spaces range from apartments to garages to unfinished buildings. And often shelter and work are acquired in clandestine ways in order to survive. And again, just to remind you that UNHCR refugees have to pledge not to work. But their allowances per month are actually really, really quite low. I mean, I was looking at a news piece the other day where it was talking about a family of 4 or 5 people where their monthly allowance amounted to $100 that they would receive, which is not much given that Lebanon is quite an expensive country. So many people move into informal areas of cities where housing can be more affordable and where Syrians can hide if illegal. And again, while the Lebanese are sympathetic to the plight of Syrians, many also take advantage of their precarious situation. So we've seen reports of the exploitation in the labor market, and yesterday there was a very interesting paper on Turkey which talked about many of the same issues. And exploitation and evictions in the domain of shelter have also been reasonably well documented. And again, just to remind us from before that Syrians have to have lease agreements and housing pledges, and those going down the sponsorship route also have to have sponsors on the Lebanese side, which all of this makes the condition for exploitation quite ripe. And as I've noted earlier, many Syrians are too poor to renew their papers, and registering with UNHCR can often be quite difficult, rendering them illegal in the country. So in this scenario, both refugees and local populations suffer because businesses can and do exploit cheap labor and the desperation of refugees, which also harms the local population who can see their wages lowered or their jobs gone. Again, very similar to what we're seeing in urban areas in Turkey as well. So the informal sector that becomes the space in which many Syrians find refuge operates as a flexible gray space of labor and employment opportunities. But as some scholars like Sylvia Pasquetti and Giovanni Pickering remind us in their recent work, that we must recognize that informality can also be a form of confinement. They argue that we need to think about informality and confinement relationally, that spaces of confinement produce informality, and that informality also produces confinement. So they note that informal urban spaces can be experienced as confining not just physically, but also at the level of cognition, emotions, and temporality. In the case of Lebanon, where the crisis has now become protracted and the living conditions increasingly impossible, the constant threats of eviction, detention, and potential deportation can produce a sense of emotional insecurity that can limit the activities of people, including their mobility, creating certain forms of confinement even outside of the spaces of camps. So in effect then, what Syrians are reduced to is what we see in, what I would argue we see in detention centers as well, which is forms of waiting out their time in Lebanon, living in conditions of poverty and precariousness. This too is a colonization of their futures, and this compels many of them to move in very particular ways, either outwards to other countries in search of better futures, and hence we see a lot of people attempting precarious journeys across the Mediterranean and through other routes into Europe, or back to so-called safe zones in Syria, and we've seen scattered sort of news reports on looking at how Syrians have found it better to sort of move back into Syria rather than being in many of their host countries, or circulating through the country where cost of living and employment prospects may be more promising. And I would argue that these two are corridors of movement, and ones that perhaps are given less attention than the spectacular movements of people across borders that we see flash across our television screens. But these clandestine movements of people around towns, around villages, I think offer very bleak prospects for non-camp futures of refuge. So to sort of bring this to a kind of a close, there are a couple of different issues that I hope that I've helped to raise. The first is, why would a state make hundreds of thousands of people invisible, especially when its primary preoccupation is security? And studies of the state have suggested the opposite, that the state moves to make populations in places visible, knowable, mappable, so as to exert greater control over them. Yet in the case of Lebanon, the state appears to move to do exactly the opposite. Here the law, I would argue, is partially performative. It is not intended, in fact, to be a blanket enforcement or implementation, but rather a tool to control and manage tensions that may exist between refugees and local communities, and to keep them together, and to keep together sort of a fragile stalemate in the country, particularly as the state claims to face an existential crisis because of the refugee situation. So importantly then, the ad hoc enforcement of laws and policies and the erasure of Syrians from the Lebanese landscape are means to control the migration of Syrians, either to turn them away from the border, and so reduce their numbers to returning them, or sending them elsewhere, or discouraging them to come in the first place. Thus, the performative nature of making and enforcing the law is deliberate and strategic, to uphold international obligations of non-refoulement while managing a growing crisis at home. Secondly, I hope I have highlighted the management of migration that occurs not just at the scale of the nation state, but also at other scales of government, such as the municipality, and arguably even at the scale of the home and the workplace. And there's some very interesting work that's also coming out in the case of the United Kingdom. I have a colleague who's at the LSE who's doing some really fascinating work about looking at how the migration policies that are put in place by UKVA are actually being enforced by landlords in the United Kingdom, and basically how landlords are being coerced by the government to become sort of agents of border enforcement. And there's sort of very interesting ways in which this is happening in different contexts. But in the context of Lebanon, as with many other countries in different parts of the world that may not be signatories to the Refugee Convention, or may not uphold them in any significant way, we may see the fragmentation, the contradiction, and or the cooperation of different forms of policing at different scales of governance. And such fragmentation that relies on the arbitrary exercise of power can be deeply oppressing and debilitating for refugees in ways that are not entirely dissimilar to refugee camps. And finally, I think we need to explore the politics of urbanity in greater depth as we bring refugees into the fold. For me, I think that the urban is too often celebrated as a site of politics. And while it does provide unique forms of citizenship, of belonging, of political possibilities, and so forth, these can neither be taken for granted, nor can they be generalized. Urban residents in many parts of the world have struggled with crippling forms of marginalization, as a lot of work around urban politics has revealed. Refugees who have no political rights outside of camps can become doubly marginalized within this context, as they neither enjoy political rights nor economic or other rights, and can be subject not only to destitution, but also deportation. The privatization of responses, such as what we see within the Lebanese context, may thus be flexible in terms of accommodating large numbers of displaced people, but the costs of that flexibility can also be quite high. In this sense, the distinction between the camp and the city begins to dissolve, and many of the dilemmas that we face when we interrogate camp spaces haunt the urban as well. So for me, I think that this in fact spells dark futures, not just for refugees, but for urbanization as well.